Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And I just want to take a moment and say thank you to Pew Research Center for making this conversation possible, as well as to our dear friends at Village Square who come alongside us in this work. And now let's get right to it. I am so happy to be joined today by H.W. Brands. Professor Brands holds the Jack S. Blanton Sr. Chair in History at the University of Texas at Austin. He's written histories and biographies that include The General versus the President, a New York Times bestseller, Founding Partisans, and his most recent book, America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War, which we'll be discussing today. Two of his biographies, The First American and Traitor to His Cause, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Professor Brands, thank you so much for joining us today. How you doing?
My pleasure. Delighted to be with you.
Oh, great. This is great. It's a real thrill for me. And I know you're prolific, not just in your writing, but in your appearances. So I'm thrilled that I'd be a part of it. One thing about your background, I figured we'd start there. I was really intrigued to learn that you started out down the mathematics track.
I did.
Yeah. Is that unique? Because usually folks are either math and science or humanities. So one is that as unique as I think it is, and two is how does that inform your thinking and your work as a historian?
So I don't know too many other people who combine the two interests. So
Yeah.
it's not usual. But in my case, I always enjoyed math. As a student, I was fairly good at it. And mathematics is one of those things, it's a little bit like musical ability or athletic ability. If you're good at it, you get encouraged to keep doing it.
Yeah.
And so it came fairly easily. And so I just kept taking math classes. And I got to college, and I thought I was going to be an engineer at first. I didn't wind up going very far in engineering, but I was, in effect, a math major for a while. Again, just because I would take, and math classes sort of are arranged in order. So you take trigonometry, then you take calculus, then you do this and that and so on. And so I just kept doing it. Eventually, though, as an undergraduate, I discovered that to get a math major where I was studying, you had to take some applied math courses, more precisely science classes that I didn't particularly like. I always liked my math just theoretical. And so in the meantime, though, just to fill out my course schedule every semester, I would look for extra courses. I'd take my math courses, but I'd look for other things. And the courses that looked most interesting turned out to be history courses, because history courses usually have interesting titles. And the great thing about history classes is, well, I can appreciate this because I eventually became a math teacher and then a history teacher both. And if you're intrinsically like math classes can be interesting. But even if they're interesting, they're fairly dry. Whereas history is full of the blood and guts of what people do. And as a history teacher, I often think that I have a big advantage over my colleagues in physics and engineering and so on, because I tell my students, because when I make a point of teaching a required class in American history. And in fact, my semester is going to start on Monday. And the first question I'm going to ask is, how many of you are here because you have to be here? And 95% of the students are going to raise their hand. And these are the science students. These are the ones who, they got to get this course out of the way.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a big advantage because I know that what I tell them is going to be intrinsically more interesting than what they're learning in engineering. They're learning engineering because they have to learn this stuff. But I'm going to tell them about the lives of real people. I'm going to tell them stories about people who are very much like them. And so I just tell them, just sit back, listen to the stories, take them into the stories. So I get to hook them that way. Anyway, so I have never really found a way of combining my interest in math and history. But you asked me what advantages or what is done for me. If anything, I think maybe it has made me more comfortable with a sort of an analytical way of dealing with arguments. Arguments are made in law, arguments are made in politics all the time. And of course, arguments are the essence of mathematics. Mathematics is just all about axioms, theorems, and so on, and the causal reasoning connecting them. And in mathematics, you say, well, wait a minute, does that really necessarily imply that? Because that's what the whole enterprise is. And so when politicians, when historians, when academics, they make arguments where the reasoning is a little bit sloppy, I say, no, 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 no. So I think that that may be one of the things that has come away from this. Occasionally, I dabble in sort of writing episodes in the history of mathematics because I'm still interested in the subject. I have a
Yeah.
Substack column, and the Substack column occasionally includes moments from the history of mathematics. So I still indulge it a little bit.
Yeah, I love mixing in. My Substack has a certain bent to it. Obviously, talking politics and religion without killing each other. But I got to mix in my own interests. New
Yeah,
York
sure.
Mets or rock and roll, Bruce Springsteen here and there. Uh,
Exactly.
the other
Yeah.
thing, though, I will say, I did. It didn't occur to me until I just heard you say what you said. But thinking in an order, a certain orderly way from your mathematics background. For example, not just in terms of one book, like you follow a narrative in the latest book, America First, but also over a period of time. The six biographies, for example, from, if I'm remembering correctly, from Ben Franklin through Roosevelt. Is that fair to say that you thought in an orderly way across larger periods of
Yeah,
time
but
that
that
way?
actually had a different origin. When I was young and ambitious, I approached a publisher with the idea of writing a six-volume history of the United States. And
I
I
love
thought,
it.
it's a big story,
Yeah,
and it
yeah.
could take, 6 volumes or so. And this was at a professional meeting of historians. And so I pitched the idea to a publisher, and the publisher just sort of laughed and said, "Oh, come on, nobody writes that sort of thing these days. Nobody publishes it, and so on." And so I sort of quietly put the project aside, but I still thought it was a good idea.
Yeah.
And so I came at it indirectly. I decided that I was going to write this history of the United States in 6 volumes, but I wasn't going to tell anybody that it was a history of the United States. What I was going to write was 6 biographies because I had observed the reading and purchasing habits of students of history. What kind of
Yeah.
books do they like? What kind of books do they read? What kind of books do they buy?
Mm,
And I found that biographies are an easier sell to people who don't consider themselves really hardcore historian types because a biography is simply a life of an individual. If somebody, wants to learn about Bruce Springsteen, well, hey, he's an interesting guy.
yeah.
I'll buy a book about that. And so I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a series of biographies. Now, every biography is, in some ways, a life and times. You write about the individual, but you have to provide context for the individual's life. So it's about the times as well. Now, being a historian by training, I knew that I was going to fill in more of the times than would be the case of someone who was just strictly a biographer. And I
Mm,
thought, okay, who am I going to choose and how am I going to choose them? Well, I'm going to choose 6 individuals whose lives are connected chronologically so that when you take them all one after the other, you cover the entire field of American history.
yeah.
So the first book in the series was a biography of Benjamin Franklin. And I didn't tell my publisher it was going to be part of a series. I just said, I don't want to write a biography of Benjamin Franklin. Oh, he's an interesting guy. Sure, we'll do it.
Right.
And I wrote the book, and the book was well received. So when I pitched the next one, a biography of Andrew Jackson, I said, well, okay, your first one did pretty well. We'll go with this one. But the thing is that for each biography, I chose the individual because the individual had to be interesting, first of all, had to be compelling character in his own right. But the individual also had to symbolize or summarize what's going on in America during this person's lifetime. I thought of it in terms of what sort of historical task does this individual have to be part of or accomplish? My
Mm,
book on Benjamin Franklin, I called The First American.
first American. Yeah.
And the reasoning there was that Benjamin Franklin was born an Englishman.
Right.
He died an American. He was of that first generation who considered themselves Americans.
Yeah.
How did that come about? And so the book is really all about, you could call it the Americanization of Benjamin Franklin. But
Mm,
of course, it's also about the Americanization of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the whole generation of
right.
people. And Franklin finally dies. And as I'm writing the end of the Franklin book, I'm sort of setting up the next book. And so Franklin is an old man at the time of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And that felt in secret. And he comes out of the convention and nobody knows what's been going on behind those closed doors. But finally, they open the doors. The convention is over. Franklin comes out. And this woman, a matriarch of Philadelphia, meets him on the street and says, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. So this is the challenge that Franklin lays down to the next generation. And that's the challenge that I pick up in the next book,
Right.
which is about Jackson. And then I wrote a book about Ulysses Grant, which carries it through the Civil War.
Right.
And then
And
Theodore
Reconstruction.
Roosevelt,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
about the Gilded Age in the early part of the 20th century. Then Franklin Roosevelt, the book you
Right.
mentioned there, Traitor to His Class. And then the final one, the sixth, was about Ronald Reagan, which carries a story into the 21st century.
Reagan. Right. Right. Yeah, I chopped off the last chapter of that 6 volume, but okay. So, I did want to ask you obviously about America First. As soon as I started reading it, I remembered a concept that you've discussed, and that is the distinction between little history and big history. Do you remember what I'm referring to?
Yeah,
So
sure.
if you can
This is the
reset
point.
what you mean by that, and maybe give us some examples, because that really struck me. As soon I was 10 pages in, and I better understood what you meant by that.
Yeah. So it's a point that I make with my classes as well. So history is often thought of as the stuff that happens in public. The stuff you read about in history books is the stuff that is the headlines in the newspapers. It's a history of war and peace and new inventions and the writing of constitutions, the creation of new countries, and so on. That's the big history. That's the history that influences a whole lot of people at once. But everybody, each of us, has our own history. And this is what I call little history. It's the history of daily life. It's a history of you and me. My father owned an 8-volume, seven volume biography of George Washington by a well-known journalist historian named Douglas Freeman. And my dad used to point at those books sitting on the shelf in his study. And he would say, I read those 7 volumes, and I can tell you what George Washington had for breakfast every day of his life. He slightly exaggerated, but that was the level of detail
Yeah.
that the books went into. And I thought about that. I kept that in mind because what George Washington had for breakfast, whether he had indigestion, whether he was feeling lousy, had an effect on the little history of his life, had an effect on the big history. Because if he had been indisposed at the time of the Battle of Yorktown, it might have turned out differently. And I use it to examine what I call the intersection of big history and little history, and this, by the way, is a justification for many biographies. This is why we write about these figures, because their individual lives have an impact on the larger history. But I also do it, especially with my students, because very few of them, very few of any of us, are going to be worthy of biographies in our lifetimes. Most of us don't rise to the level of big history, but we all have importance. We all have our own lives. And so I try to tell the history of the United States with my students, often in terms of this little history stuff. So I will find some individual. I usually pick individuals maybe who aren't particularly well known, but also it's crucial. I'm teaching college students. Most of them are freshmen and sophomores, so they're 18 and 19 years old. So I try to find individuals in history who are roughly their age.
Yeah.
And who have to make a decision. They have to come up to a point where you got to do this or you got to do that. One that I use is the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. His name was William Temple Franklin. And William Temple Franklin, at the age that he was about 16 when the story unfolds. And he has to decide in the middle of the American Revolutionary War whether he's going to join his grandfather. Benjamin Franklin is about to get on the boat and head off to Paris to try to negotiate the treaty with France. And Benjamin Franklin is saying to his grandson, he was called Temple, come with me. This is what you got to do. This is the future you got to have. But it's complicated by the fact that Temple's father was a loyalist, was an opponent of the revolution.
Right.
And his father is saying, no, don't go with your grandfather. Don't become a rebel. Your grandfather is likely to be hanged. You have to be loyal to the crown. So Temple has to make this decision. And I sort of put it to my students. If you were Temple Franklin in 1776, you're 16 years old, your grandfather is saying, come with me. Your father is saying this. Now, bear in mind that the decision that you make is probably going to determine the entire course of your life.
Yeah.
And it's not just for you. It's, well, if you go to Europe, you're going to get a good education. Yes. But if America loses the revolution, you will be branded a traitor for the rest of your life and you will not be able to advance. So think this over very carefully. And I ask my students to think about it. I don't, there's no right answer. And then eventually I tell them what Temple did. And I guess I could tell your audience, he
Sure.
decided to go with his grandfather.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
anyway, but this is where little history and big history come together.
Yeah, it's another point that I forget where I heard you say it or read where you wrote it, but that little history of the conversation between a father and a son, and then a grandfather and a grandson, underscores something that I think we lose sight of. That we look at the founding fathers, and we revere the founding fathers, and but our, for lack of a better word, our conservatism in revering the founding fathers doesn't do them justice. It's not in the spirit of the founding fathers, in
That's
that
exactly right.
they
That's
were
exactly right.
they were
I'll mention two,
rebels.
two illustrations of this. So over the years, I've spoken pretty often with a group called the Daughters of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
This is a patriotic group. Usually they have some connection by descent from somebody who fought in the revolution. And so they preserve the memory of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, people like this in historic places. It turns out, and maybe this wouldn't be a surprise to your audience, that they tend to be fairly conservative politically. And so I'm on good terms with them all, but I
Yeah.
often can't resist teasing them because typically they meet for lunch. And so they'll be eating lunch and I'll say, well, I have to remind you that if you had actually been alive during the American Revolution, you probably would not have sided with the revolutionaries. You
Right.
would have been loyalists, because this is from what I know of the strata of society that you're in. And so this is one aspect of it where the sort of the context of it all really kind of makes this point. But it's really worth keeping in mind, especially as it relates to groups like the Founding Fathers,
Yeah.
because as you aptly point out, there is a tendency to hold them in reverence. And they certainly didn't revere each other. If you read the letters, if you read what John Adams is saying about Thomas Jefferson, no, there is no reverence here at all.
The
And
original smack talkers.
as a historian, I often get asked, so what would Thomas Jefferson think if he came back today and saw us? Or what would George Washington think, and so on? And my first response is, well, I don't really know. They're long dead and things have changed a lot. But on this topic, I do say, and I'm pretty confident in this answer, that far from being gratified that they were held in such reverence and that we're still using the Constitution that they wrote in 1787, I think they would be shocked and dismayed because they certainly did not write a document that they expected would last almost 250 years. If they learned at this late date that it had lasted that long, they would have said, "What's wrong with you people? We fought a revolution. We wrote constitutions. The Constitution of 1787, that was our second try at a national constitution. We junked the first one after 5 years, the Articles of Confederation. We wrote a bunch of constitution for the states, and you're still using this one? Where is your imagination? Where is your boldness?" And to the extent that they might see that they're being held in reverence, well, they're probably immodest enough to say, well, fine if you want to revere me. But if Jefferson would say, you can revere me if you want to, but don't revere Hamilton for heaven's sake. He doesn't worth. He was a scoundrel. So,
Right, right. That's great. So in terms of America First, I one of the things I really appreciated about it, and a lot of your work is this way, is I'm tracking with. It's almost as if I'm tracking with a fiction, in that I'm tracking with characters, and it's a character study as much as it's a story. So, in terms of the history itself, number one, what was it that drew you to these two particular characters? There were other supporting characters, if you'll allow me to use that language. You know, Churchill, for example, or earlier in the book, Joe Kennedy. But what drew you to Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh as your central characters? And as a follow-up and related, I love were were you were there was there a moral question that you were asking of these two main characters?
So why these characters and why do I use them the way they do? Well, I have a biographical approach to any kind of history that I write. I tend not to write in structural terms. I don't try to analyze great sweeping changes in terms of the big ideas. I ground everything in individuals because of this. I was talking about little history and big history. To
Right.
me, the interesting part of history is where the lives of individuals intersect these big questions. So everything, so it was very natural to me to do what I explained just a few minutes ago, write the history of the United States in the form of these biographies, because history is played out in the lives of individuals. So when I decided that I wanted to write about the debate over whether the United States should enter World War II, and this is what my book America First is about. And the subtitle is Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. To set it up for the audience, Europe goes to war in September 1939. The United States and Americans generally say, this is not our war, we don't want to get involved. But over the course of the next 2 years and 3 months, ending in December 1941, the United States participates in a very profound debate over, in a narrow sense, should the United States go to the aid of France and Britain, and then just Britain, against Germany in the war in Europe? Related to that, should the United States go to the aid of China against Japan? So there are two wars going on. But the larger question is, what should be the role of the United States in the world?
Right.
Should the United States take a leadership position? The United States by 1940 was the most powerful country in the world economically. It was the richest country in the world, and by virtue of its economic power, it could be the most powerful country in the world militarily if it chose to do that. But as of the end of the 1930s, Americans had not chosen to do that. Americans thought that the best interest of their country was to mind America's own business at home and maybe pay attention to what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, but do not get involved in the wars of Europe. Europe is always at war, and for the United States to do that will simply get the United States involved in other people's war. So that's the setting. And in this setting, two individuals take opposite positions in this debate. Franklin Roosevelt, slowly, slyly at first, is pushing in the direction of a position of American leadership in the world. He doesn't at first say that the United States ought to go to war on behalf of Britain. In fact, he's very slow to say precisely that. But he says we must take action to support Britain. We must send Britain arms. We must send Britain money. We must send Britain more ships. We must help Britain. And now I know this because I've learned about Franklin Roosevelt. I wrote a biography about him.
Yeah.
He has decided that yes, the United States should take this position of world leadership, and it will probably involve American intervention in this war. He is politically savvy enough to know that if he says this too soon, then he will spook Americans who have a bad experience, a memory of a bad experience in World War I, where they got involved in Europe's war. And they were on the winning side, but the peace afterwards was exceedingly unsatisfactory. So Americans swore up and down, we'll never do that again. Roosevelt knew he had to be very careful about changing this opinion. He would slowly lead these, I'll use the term of the day, isolationists, away from their isolationism to a position that countenanced intervention. So Roosevelt is the leader of that side. Charles Lindbergh is the leader of the opposite side. Charles Lindbergh takes the position it was a bad idea to enter the European war in World War I. It would be a worse idea if we do it again. The problems of Europe are Europe's problems. They cannot be solved by us. And all that will happen if we get involved in Europe's problems is Europe will become our problem. Lindbergh was not advocating pacifism by any means. He said we need to arm America to the teeth.
Right.
And if Germany decides to come after us, we'll let them come because we'll smack them down when they get to our shores. But, said Lindbergh, we don't have to think that America's defensive frontier lies in the middle of Europe on the Rhine River or something. No. That's why there's this big ocean between Europe and us. If they're going to come after us, we'll fight them closer to home where we will have the advantage. So this is the argument. This is the debate that takes place. Now, I'm somebody who believes in the power of the written and the spoken word. And especially in a debate like this, I think what the individuals said mattered a lot. They took care. Roosevelt took care in what he was saying when he was saying we need to change the laws that mandate neutrality. He wasn't saying, and we need to make sure that Britain doesn't lose this war. He was thinking that, but he wasn't saying it yet. Slowly, his language changes. And the way Lindbergh couched his arguments, this was important too.
Yeah.
Because Lindbergh was taking the position that the United States should not join Britain against Germany. Now, he was criticized by Roosevelt and others who said, boy, he is just doing Germany's work for it.
Yeah.
Because by keeping the United States out of the war, then it'll make it easier for Germany to defeat Britain. And I wanted to let readers know that Lindbergh didn't think he was doing that at all. However, Lindbergh thought the United States must make these decisions on its own terms and not be stampeded into war. And so much of the argument becomes bitter and personal. Lindbergh was called a traitor. He was called a fifth columnist, which was a term for somebody who stabs your own people in the back.
Yeah, from within the country, right?
Exactly. And so I actually thought of the book in terms of a play.
Yeah.
With two main characters. Because, and I'll sort of tip my author's hand, Roosevelt and Lindbergh actually met in person only once.
Oh.
But in my book, you'd think they're, talking back and forth to each other.
Right,
in fact,
right.
What would happen is Roosevelt would give a speech advocating this change in the American position. He would go on the radio to give a speech, or he'd give the speech before Congress and be carried on the radio. Lindbergh then would request airtime on the radio networks of the day. Now, the reason he would get airtime was that he was a celebrity. He was a star. Everybody knew his name.
I was curious about that. He didn't have an official position, from what I can understand, but he was meeting heads of state and ambassadors. And
when I decided to write the book, I realized I needed to figure out why he was listened to so carefully.
Right.
Because exactly as you say, he had no official position. He wasn't a diplomat. He did have expertise in aerial warfare. He was famous because he flew across the Atlantic in 1927, the first time anybody had flown one stop, one flight across the Atlantic. And he became a star as a result of that. He was young, he was handsome, he was well-spoken, he married well. And so there was this, he was kind of the golden boy of his age until tragedy struck.
Right.
When, partly because he was so famous and because the family was rich, that he married into was rich, his infant son and the infant son of his wife was kidnapped and murdered. And so in some ways, this made him an even more compelling character than before. So it wasn't that Lindbergh, everything had gone well for this golden boy, not at all. Things were going so well, and then tragedy struck. And so he was almost this star-crossed hero. And then he becomes the spokesperson for the anti-war position. How did this happen? Well, partly because he did have this expertise in air power. He was a you could call him an informal aircraft engineer, but he designed his own plane, and he made a point of keeping up with developments in aircraft technology. But also, because he was a celebrity, if he asked the Mutual Broadcasting System, it was a national radio network, this is before television. If he said, can I have 20 minutes to give a speech on the radio? They said, sure, because they knew that people would tune in and they would listen and they'd hear the commercials, and Mutual Broadcasting System would make money. He'd get good ratings.
Yeah.
And maybe to their surprise, to my surprise as the author, he actually had some really sensible things to say.
Right.
He argued he was obviously an intelligent guy. He was well-read. He argued his case very well. And he argued his case at a serious disadvantage precisely because he wasn't president of the United States. The
Right.
president of the United States can say, well, let's make this happen, and it happens. Lindbergh had no control over anybody. All he could do was appeal to the intellect of his listeners. But he and Roosevelt kind of slugged it out almost on equal terms until the weight of events finally told against Lindbergh. This is no spoiler to say that the United States actually did wind up going into war.
That's right.
Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, and that sort of made the decision and ended the debate.
Yeah. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book was the extensive passages that were quoted throughout. Because what it allowed me to do was it allowed me to get inside the head of each of these characters that you deal with. And for just as one example, one of the surprise. One of the things that I understood better, I grew up in a very observant Jewish home. So when you say Charles Lindbergh, you immediately think anti-Semite. Well, I would still say that he wasn't necessarily a friend of the Jews, but the way that he talked about the Jewish people, he was genuinely concerned. When he first went to Germany, I think it was in the mid to late 30s, in his diaries, he expressed concern about the way the Jewish people were being treated. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
I got a better understanding of he did say some things that even in 1939 were pretty incendiary, the way he talked about the white race, for example. But at least I better understood that he thought about it his own grandfather was from Sweden, and he thought about European or Western civilization more as a peoplehood and his peoplehood or his heritage. Or I don't know, maybe am I giving him too much credit? Am I looking to humanize him too much?
Well, the first thing that I will say is for him to talk about the white race was utterly unexceptional at a time when the United States had race written into its interpretation of the Constitution. This was the age of
Oh, yeah,
segregation.
yeah,
You couldn't go to a restaurant in Washington, D.C. if you
right,
were black. And so everybody was aware of the white race. Now, 80 years later, Americans like to think, oh, well, the good people back then didn't have race on the mind.
yeah,
Well, yeah, I mean, everybody did. That's
yeah,
just, it came with being American in that period. And yeah, so this is, I mean, you asked a question, at least you started asking a question about, is there a moral issue involved here?
right.
And in this, in fact, there is, I think, a very deep moral question that is involved. Now, opinions differ on whether morality ought to be the deciding factor. But one of the questions that came up in this debate, especially, was so by 1939, it's really clear that Nazi Germany has instituted these anti-Semitic policies. That Jews are being discriminated against, they're being run out of the professions, they're being driven out of the country. Nobody knows exactly where this is going to go. And the question comes up for, well, any sensitive person is if these bad things are happening to the Jewish people, and I should add, they're happening to non-Jewish French people and Poles and everything else, but if bad things are happening in the world and the United States has the power to do something about it, does the United States therefore have an obligation to
Mm,
do something about it? And people would say, well, if I'm walking down the street and I see this toddler, start to toddle out into traffic, well, yeah, I have an obligation to go and try to keep the kid from getting run over. But what if going out in the traffic to keep the kid from getting run over risks your life? Do you have the obligation then? And this is sort of where it goes. If the United States could have waved its finger and said to Hitler, stop being nasty to the Jews, and that would have done it, well, sure, everybody say would do it. But should the United States risk the death of thousands of Americans in a war against Germany? This was the question that was debated. I should add, it's a question that has never gone away.
right.
There's a war going on in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine almost 3 years ago, and a lot of people in Ukraine have gotten killed. And most Americans agree that Russia was the aggressor here and Russia is in the wrong. But does that mean that the United States has an obligation to send troops into Ukraine to drive back the Russians and save the innocent Ukrainians? Well, so far, the American people have not said yes to this. They've never said exactly no, and so we're sort of left in this middle position. And actually, That's one of the reasons I decided to write the book. I
Mm.
started writing the book before the current Ukraine war began, but I could tell, if only because of the first election of Donald Trump, that people were starting to revisit this question of what obligation the United States has to other people and countries around the world. And so, for example, during the Obama presidency, a civil war broke out in Syria. And lots of people in Syria were getting killed. Lots of innocent people were being driven from their homes. Did the United States have an obligation to go in and try to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria? And most Americans said, nah, maybe we'll accept a few more refugees, but most of the refugees wound up in Europe and they tend to destabilize politics there. But the question, there's always somebody suffering in the world somewhere. And if you happen to be a powerful country, you can at least entertain the idea, the possibility of going to their assistance. Will your action do more harm than good? And that's a thing you balance. The United States went into Vietnam in the 1950s to defend South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam. And there were strategic reasons for doing it, but part of it was out of a belief on the part of Americans that the South Vietnamese should not have to suffer under a communist dictatorship, which is what would happen if South Vietnam fell. So the United States fought a war there for 15 years, lost the war, and most Americans today think it was a bad idea to do it. But one understands part of the moral argument as to why Americans were there. Now, this is a question that is peculiarly salient for powerful countries. If, you know, if we're Belgium, nobody's expecting Belgium to work wonders around the world. It doesn't have the wherewithal, the resources to do it. This is one of those, Spider-Man deals with great power comes great responsibility. How do you use that responsibility? And so I wanted to look at sort of the origin of the idea that the United States had an obligation to the world to use its power. Because in 1935, which is really the backstory of my story, if you put the question to Americans, they would say, hell no, we don't. We tried it in World War I and it didn't work. No, we have an obligation only to ourselves. But after this debate with Charles Lindbergh, Franklin Roosevelt persuaded Americans, we have an obligation to the world.
Yeah.
Now, it's always a complicated question and answer because we're not doing this simply out of charitable feelings for people in other countries. It's partly because the United States want to establish a world order that is more conducive to American interests. The two always go together. But there was this abrupt change in American thinking and more precisely in the direction of American policy. And that abrupt change is really the subject of this book, America First.
So one of my big takeaways was in comparing the two, and on the one hand, I was edified to learn about the principles behind Lindbergh's positions, and that he was indeed principled in his own way. Setting aside, it's a big setting aside the issues that someone like I might have, or any number of folks might have with how he sees race, as we just discussed. But there were definitely principles there. The other thing was that comparing Lindbergh to FDR was a savvy politician. And in comparison, Lindbergh was naive, to say the least. But the other takeaway was that the savvy of FDR really bled into deceptiveness. So on the little history, if we look at it that way, but the deceptiveness helped him win the day, win the debate, as you just put it. If we're taking Thomas Aquinas's Just War, if ever there was one, it was World War II. So the little deception that allowed us to win the Just War. Is it? Am I making too much of this? Or?
No, and this raises another moral question.
Yeah.
Is it moral for a president to lie to the American people in the service of a greater good? And I was able to sort of pin this down at a particular moment. There's actually a crucial moment in this debate. It's just before the election of 1940. Franklin Roosevelt is in the process of attempting to break the informal two-term limit
Right.
on the presidency. And he's able to do it. The excuse that he takes is that with the country, the world at war like this, we need an experienced hand at the helm. And Lindbergh is criticizing him. Lindbergh is saying that if we elect Franklin Roosevelt a third time, we'll never get him out of office till he dies. He'll run a fourth time, he'll get elected, he will die in office. And furthermore, a point that Lindbergh made again and again was the president is misleading us closer and closer to war. Every step he takes, he says, it's keeping us out of war. If we send weapons to the British, they will be able to fight, so we won't have to fight. If we send money to the British, they will be able to fight, so we won't have to fight. But every time Lindbergh said, you watch, this isn't the last step, there will be another step. And every time that other step came, Lindbergh said, and Roosevelt is doing this in part out of his belief for what's good with the United States, but it's also about what's good for Franklin Roosevelt, because he's got power in his hands and he doesn't want to give it up. So Roosevelt, trying to evade the question of whether he's going to send Americans, whether Americans are going to be fighting in war, he's trying to actually deny it.
Yeah.
And so a week before the election of 1940, he says, I will not send Americans to fight in a foreign war. Before this, he had always said, unless we're attacked, unless things change or something like that. But at this last rally before the election, he takes off that condition. And his son, James Roosevelt, after it turned out that Americans were fighting in the war, he calls his dad out on this. And James Roosevelt ultimately wrote a memoir about this. And he said, Dad, how could you say that when you knew Americans were going to be going to war? How could you say that they're not going to? And he said, Jimmy, if I had told the American people the truth, they never would have been able to listen to the rest of what I had to say. They would have I would have been identified as the warmonger, and we wouldn't have been able to get what we needed. And Jimmy Roosevelt said, okay. But then he said, and well, Dad, how much of it was just because you wanted to get elected again? And Franklin Roosevelt, to his credit, said, yeah, that was part of it too. So, you know, it was one of those moments when, because I can see what Roosevelt's saying to various people in a way that Lindbergh can't. Lindbergh is simply inferring all of this from what Roosevelt says and then what he does. But I can hear Franklin Roosevelt telling his son, yeah, Lindbergh's right.
Yeah.
But Lindbergh, doesn't have the advantage of this. So, but another thing that I found interesting and useful was that Lindbergh was making other predictions that were borne out. I guess maybe I should just remind the audience that when Lindbergh said that if Roosevelt gets elected a third time, he's going to get elected a fourth time, he's going to be president for life. That's exactly what happened, because Roosevelt was elected a fourth time and he died in his fourth term.
Yeah.
And Lindbergh said, if America goes back into Europe again, went in World War I, came home. If we go back into Europe again, we're never going to be able to get out. Well, it's 80 years after the end of World War II, and American troops and American interests are still thick on the ground in Europe. So Lindbergh saw this coming. Lindbergh also pointed out that when Franklin Roosevelt said, this is a war to defend democracy, Lindbergh said, give me a break. This is a war to defend Britain. Is Britain a democracy? Well, yeah, sort of in Britain, but Britain has this huge empire. Ask the 100 million Indians if they think that the British Empire is a democracy. Not at all. In fact, British protesters who wanted independence for Britain, 100,000 of them have been thrown in jail because they were simply saying that India ought to have self-government. And this is what Lindbergh said even before Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt, under terms of the Lend-Lease Act, simply on his authority as president, said, okay, now we're sending American money and American weapons to Soviet Russia. Then Lindbergh saying, oh my gosh, we're not defending democracy at all. We're defending Soviet communism. So, Mr. President, don't talk about defending democracy. We're just defending the allies of the moment.
Mm,
So, I mean, Lindbergh, he pointed out these things that turned out to be true. And one last thing, and this is, I write here as a historian and somebody who has written about the history of the United States since World War II. And I've lived a substantial portion of that period. And I know that World War II, uniquely among America's wars, is the war that has never had its revisionists. Every
mm,
other American war has had people come along and say, wait, was that war really justified? Was that
right.
really a war worth fighting? Not World War II. World War II remains the good war in American history. And I sometimes have to say, well, what are we talking about? World War II, a good war? It was the worst war in human history.
Yeah.
60 million people died in World War II. Maybe you can say it was a necessary war, but please don't call it a good war. And by the way, it's a war that ended with a decision by the President of the United States to drop weapons that killed 150,000 non-combatants. Nobody would have conceived of that before the war. If
Right.
anybody suggested, they said, my God, he's a war criminal. But this is what the United States is driven to. And and a lot of it has to do with, I would just say, the success of Roosevelt in winning the debate,
Mm,
in posing this in these moral terms for the United States. Now, it is true, it's quite true, that Hitler made a very good villain for anybody who wants the United States to feel good about the war. Except that when the United States allied with Joseph Stalin, Stalin had more blood on his hands
yeah.
before the war began than Hitler had, even by the end of the war,
Right.
with all the millions that were killed in the collectivization campaign in Ukraine, among other places, in the 1930s. But the United States allied with that. So I sort of wanted to remind Americans that even if you do think, and most Americans do think that the United States should play this leading role in the world, just remember that there are complicated issues involved here.
Yeah.
I'll add one last thing to get back to what you were mentioning about Lindbergh. So Lindbergh was sort of written out of polite company because of a speech that he gave in Des Moines, Iowa in the autumn of
41.
1941, in which
Yeah.
he identified three groups that were pushing particularly for American intervention in the war. The first, he said, was the British government. And he said, I understand why they're fighting a hard war and they would like our help. The second group, he said, was Jews in America. And he said, I understand why they are. Their cousins, their kinsmen in Europe are being beaten up, and it's a horrible thing. And he said, the third group is the Roosevelt administration. And the Roosevelt administration is the one that has the least excuse for their position because it's mostly to aggrandize the president. Lindbergh said a large part of what Roosevelt is doing is simply trying to gather power to the presidency so the president can make these decisions. And I mentioned that when the decision was made to send American aid, including arms and money, to the Soviet Union, Roosevelt made it entirely on his own. He didn't have to consult Congress. He said, this is going to happen. And Lindbergh said, once Congress relinquishes that authority, it's never going to get it back. At that time, it was still clear that Congress had to declare war. But Lindbergh said, you watch, Roosevelt's going to set this up. So something is going to happen that will force Congress to declare war. And in fact, the Roosevelt administration launched economic war against Japan, which is what prompted Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. And
Mm,
so after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress could not say no. And Lindbergh said, you watch. That's the way American politics is going to continue to evolve. And that part is perfectly true. And today, the
yeah.
president of the United States can decide, okay, we're going to invade Venezuela. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And Congress hardly raises a finger to oppose it, despite the fact that it's clearly written in the Constitution that Congress is the body that's supposed to declare war.
Right. Yeah. So, in all candor, I have pages and pages of other questions about this book alone, but I know we're limited on time. We could sit here for 6 hours with the questions I have. But while I have you, I feel compelled to ask you about your craft, about your process. I was talking about the letters and the diaries of that you share, the passages that you share. going and sourcing the speeches and private messages between Roosevelt and Churchill. How do you find all the material? How do you digest all the material? I'm so curious about your process.
So I like to say that we historians are prisoners of our sources. Now, this is to distinguish historians from, say, historical novelists. People who write fiction about history, they can use their imagination. I can only write what I can document.
Yeah.
So the trick here is to use what I have on these individuals, but give the impression that I know everything about these individuals. So you mentioned that Winston Churchill plays an important part in this. Why? Well, Winston Churchill is an interesting character, but also because Winston Churchill was a person that Franklin Roosevelt wrote letters to on a regular basis. Now, Roosevelt didn't write many letters. He operated in person, he operated by telephone, but he didn't write many letters. But he did write to Churchill. Roosevelt is, of all the people that I've studied in history, probably the slipperiest, the one who's hardest to figure out what he was thinking, because he was a genius at making people think he agreed with them, even when he didn't.
Roosevelt
So
or Churchill?
Three people would walk into Roosevelt's office, one after the
Roosevelt.
other,
Yeah.
arguing different positions. And each one of them would come out thinking, hey, Roosevelt agreed with me. Now, they often felt misled and misused when it turned out that he didn't, but that was the habit he had. And so how do I get inside Roosevelt's head? Well, one was by using these letters with Churchill. But of course, I understand that Roosevelt is arguing a side in his letters to Churchill. He's not bearing his soul. He's trying to make it look like he's bearing his soul, but he's keeping a few cards, close to his vest. So the historian has to take that into account. This is part of the evidence base. And I know that Churchill has a particular audience for him. What's he going to say? What can he not tell him? Roosevelt held press conferences, news conferences for newspapers, called press conferences in those days, twice a week for the 12 years that he was president. And transcripts of these press conferences survive. Now, these press conferences are different than news conferences today because they were not recorded, they were not broadcast. Moreover, the president could not be quoted without his express permission. So these are all sort of for background. These are off-the-record sorts of things. And Roosevelt is masterful in playing his audience, these dozens of reporters who crowd into his office. And he tells them some stuff and he doesn't tell them other stuff. And he makes statements that, okay, you can't quote me on that, or yeah, you can quote me on that. And so I use those sources, they're a major part of my source, to make it look as though I know everything that Roosevelt was doing. But I will be the first to admit, at times I didn't know what was going on in Roosevelt's head. With Lindbergh, the two principal sources for Lindbergh were a journal that he kept.
Yeah.
He kept it quite consistently. Now, it's a diary. And what do people write in their diaries? Well, they write what's coming into their heads, but do they write entirely candidly? Did Lindbergh expect that someday a snoopy person like me would be reading what he's writing? I think the answer is maybe partly yes. He was famous, so he knew that people had written books about him already. So he probably knew that he was writing partly for me. But when you start writing like this, sometimes you forget that there's a future audience looking over your shoulder. And then the other thing, the surprising part to me, was the speeches. And I really didn't expect the speeches to be particularly interesting or useful, but it turned out that they were, because they were very carefully crafted. They made this argument. I mentioned, we were talking earlier about what I take from mathematics, from my early training in mathematics. Well, I would follow his argument and I would say, okay, does what he's saying now follow from what went before? Mm-hmm. And in almost all cases, it did. He made a very good argument. And one of the things it reminded me of is in the days before social media, in the days before television, speeches were a way that people made political points and they tried to change people's minds. Nowadays, when people give speeches, they tend not to be speeches that change people's minds. They tend to be speeches that simply affirm the prejudices of the base audience that they're aimed for. In those days, you couldn't choose your own radio network and say, okay, I'm a
Yeah.
Democrat, I'll listen to these guys, and I'm a Republican, I'll listen to these. No, everybody listened to the same stuff. And so you can really see the working of a mind in reading Lindbergh's journals. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I like to sort of stage this as a play where it's as though in my mind, Roosevelt's standing on one side of the stage
Yeah.
and Lindbergh standing on the other side, and the spotlight will come on Roosevelt and he'll give a speech, and then Lindbergh over here will be listening, and then he'll respond.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes I try to almost make it look like Lindbergh responded the next day, and sometimes he did, but sometimes it was 2 weeks later.
Right.
You can, without violating the historian's compact with the reader, I didn't say anything that wasn't true. You can kind of foreshorten things. You can bring things together, and ideally, you can just leave out the boring stuff and focus on the good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I have more craft questions for you, but hopefully this isn't our last conversation. I'll save some of those for our next one. But normally this is where I ask folks the TP&R question: how do we talk politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible? I have somewhat of a different question for you, though. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future. What I will ask you is, I'd like to understand your thoughts on the questions we should be asking now that historians of the future will help us understand later.
Well, I think the fundamental question in the general context of the arena we've been talking about is, what is the appropriate role for the United States in the world? And I will condition this question by saying that America's position economically, in terms of its relative power with the rest of the world, is different than it was in 1940, than it was in 1945. In 1945, the American economy was the equal of the rest of the world's economy combined.
Mm.
And so the United States could effectively dictate world affairs, could say, this is the way the structure of the international affairs is going to play out. And international affairs reflected that for the next 40 or 50 years. But things have changed. And Germany has revived, Japan has revived, China has become a powerful country. So the United States is not able to dictate to the world the way it was back in the mid-1940s. And Americans are going to have to come to grips with this. And we have not had a debate comparable in its scope and its depth regarding what America's role in the world ought to be, comparable to that of Lindbergh and Roosevelt in 1940. I think it would be good if we did. I started writing the book thinking that we might have that debate in the 2024 election campaign, because at the time it looked like Donald Trump was going to get nominated again. And it looked like his position on Ukraine, for example, and the rest of the world was going to be different. He adopted the slogan, the name of the anti-war committee of Lindbergh's time, America
Right.
First.
Yeah.
So many voters thought that they were voting for someone who was going to say, okay, we're going to shrink America's responsibility in the world. Now, maybe that turns out not to have been the case at all, but nonetheless, I thought we were going to have that big debate. It didn't. It was part of the campaign of 2024. It may be that we will still have the debate, but the question is there. What is the American role in the world? And as the world's most powerful country, no longer as powerful comparatively as it was 80 years ago, still a country that is a major power. Should the United States feel that it is its obligation to defend Ukraine, to defend Taiwan, to do whatever else Americans can do? We can't do everything, and so it's going to be more a matter of what can we do and what connection ought American policy to have to American interests, but also, again, that fundamental moral question, what obligation does the United States have to other people in the world? And this can be in terms of intervention in the case of human rights violations. It could be, does the United States have an obligation to address climate change? Other stuff like this. These are questions that are appropriate for American citizens and American leaders.
Yeah, it definitely had me pondering to what degree today's America First movement are heirs of Lindbergh's principled albeit flawed, but principled isolationism, not to oversimplify it, but and then in what ways has it just become its own movement altogether?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those are some of the questions I'm grappling with. Did you have any questions for me before we start to wrap up?
Sure. What's the last good history book you read?
America
Aside from
First.
America First, which you originally just read and really liked.
I'm a sucker for biographies. There was a Bruce Springsteen biography. I don't know if you
Ah,
call that
yeah.
history, but yeah, I'm a sucker for biographies, and then also tracking with the. We're now talking about Christian nationalism, so I wanted to
Yeah.
understand the roots of that. So oh gosh, I'm gonna kick myself for not remembering the author's name off the top of my head, but tracks it going back to as early as the early 1800s here in the
Yeah.
States. Some speakers and prominent leaders. So gosh,
That's a great topic.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think it's very pertinent.
I'm gonna look up I'm gonna put it in the show notes. I'm kicking
Okay.
myself for not remembering the author, but I'll
Yeah.
put it in the show. That's a great question. So before we go, how can folks follow you and find more about your upcoming books, your latest books, and all the great work that you're doing?
Well, so I'm most active at the moment on Substack. It's hwbrands.substack.com. And I talk about all sorts of different things. The title of the Substack is A User's Guide to History. So it sometimes deals with current events, sometimes it deals with stuff that seems unrelated to anything, just whatever occurs to me. And then in May, I have a biography of George Washington that's going to be published, and it's called American Patriarch.
Great.
So your audience members can be on the lookout for that.
I was hoping you'd give us a primer, a little teaser for that. So I'm really glad you did.
Well,
We
you can
covered a
invite me
lot.
back. Then you
Yeah,
can tell the story then.
I'd love to. Is there anything important? We've just covered a lot, but is there anything important before we wrap it up that you want to add?
I think we've covered the ground really well. So
Yeah, yeah.
very good
Thanks.
questions.
Well, I really appreciate you doing this. It is such a pleasure for me to talk to you, and I look forward to doing it again real soon.
My pleasure, Corey.
You
Take care.
bet. As always, we'd like to thank Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible and our friends at Village Square. And if you dig what we're doing here, engage with us on any of the socials. I'm at Corey S. Nathan on all of them, especially over on Substack too. So let's all follow A User's Guide to History, hwbrands.substack.com. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect and have a great week.